So that's it. The Golden State Warriors season is just over. A disappointing season for them. They now go into an off season where there are way more questions than answers. And I think the biggest question here certainly is this era of Golden State Warriors basketball now just over? Now, in terms of the offseason, there's certainly a ton to talk about. First and foremost, we have the Klay Thompson free agency situation. It has been an up and down year for Klay. There were moments in the season where he was coming off the bench. There were moments where it looked like his future was very uncertain. There were moments where it looked like he was really good. And right now, I have no idea what exactly to make of where Klay may or may not end up. I know what I would do if I was the Warriors, but he's an unrestricted free agent. And I do think that even with as weird of a season as he's had, Klay Thompson is going to have suitors in free agency. I don't think this is a situation where Golden State's going to be able to bring him back on like $10 million a year. I think there are teams, I continue to point out a team like Orlando as an option for him. Any kind of team that thinks that they could do something over the next couple of seasons that wants spacing and a veteran presence, Klay Thompson can still be that for you. And I think in a different situation where there's more creators, where he isn't relied upon as much to create stuff by himself, I think Klay Thompson still has some good years left in him as a really productive starting caliber guard. I don't know that he's going to be worth the contract that he signs. It's going to cost a good amount of money, upwards of $20-25 million a year, maybe even more than that. And if I'm Golden State, I'm probably okay letting him walk. I mean, I've advocated for possibly trading him even before this point, even as tough of a situation as that would be, a tough a decision that would be for the Warriors. But they have to find a way to cut costs at some point. It's something that has been said publicly that they're trying to explore, making the team cheaper, not being in a luxury tax all the time. And they've already got, Wiggins, Steph, Draymond, they signed a big deal last year. And we already saw this last offseason as well, where they got rid of the Jordan Poole contract because they wanted to save some money. And I wouldn't be surprised if Klay Thompson has played his last game with the Warriors. And that would be as much of a sign of the end of an era as anything that could realistically happen this offseason for Golden State. The other part of this is Chris Paul is also going to be a free agent. He has a non-guaranteed final year left on his contract. They're not going to pay him $30 million next year, so they're going to get rid of the non-guaranteed year. And he's going to go into free agency. I would be shocked if he returned to Golden State. The experiment just didn't work. Again, I said this at the time of the Jordan Poole trade. It was more about them saving money than it was about, Chris Paul being a great fit there. They struggled to figure it out the entire season. Him getting hurt certainly didn't help. He's going to have suitors in free agency, not on the same level as Klay, but he's probably going to be gone as well. And when it gets to that point, when it's realistic that Golden State could lose both Klay and Chris Paul this offseason, then you start to look at what the roster is going to look like and how competitive they're truly going to be. I mean, this is a team that didn't even make the playoffs, just barely made not just barely, but, we're just within a few games of not even making the play-in. And then you're going to lose two guys that, aren't super, super critical, but still good players and helpful for you in Klay and Chris Paul. You start to wonder, is this even going to be a play-in team next year with as good as the Western Conference is, and kind of what that, line of thought leads you in the direction of. Now, things certainly are not hopeless with Golden State. Steph is still really good. Kind of a little bit of a down year for him in certain areas, but still obviously an unbelievable player. They've got some young guys. This was a big year for Jonathan Kuminga to kind of take a leap forward for him. Podziemski was good as a rookie. Trayce Jackson-Davis, I think, is something for them. Moses Moody, still kind of in and out of the rotation throughout the year, but I think there is something there for him as well. And if they really wanted to get a little bit leaner this offseason, let Klay walk, let Chris Paul walk, save some money, really prioritize some of these younger guys, I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea. This doesn't have to be a complete teardown overnight for Golden State because they do have those young pieces. The conversation is certainly going to be had about the possibility of trading some of those young pieces, namely Jonathan Kuminga, to bring in a star. And in that scenario, you would expect Golden State to bring back someone like Klay and then trade away Kuminga and some future assets for who knows who. I don't know what exactly the star they would be targeting would be, but it's going to be a conversation, right? The other part of this for Kuminga and Moody is they have 1 year left on their deals. They both need to be extended, which again is only going to continue to add to the cost of this roster. Obviously, the priority there is Kuminga. I mean, he is worth 20, 25, even more than that per year, certainly to Golden State as well as to other teams. There's a ton of untapped potential there. He's still very young, incredible athlete, really improved offensively this year. And so that, again, makes it even more difficult to bring back someone like Klay when you also have some of these other bigger contracts. And again, was one of the reasons that they dumped Jordan Poole last offseason as well. There is a situation here where they let Klay and Chris Paul walk. They re-signed Kuminga. and then they just try to keep things rolling and they don't completely give up on this era. They could also trade away Kuminga, as I mentioned. I don't think there's a possibility of them just not signing him to an extension this offseason. It's either going to be extend him or trade him. I think this is definitely the pivot point offseason for Jonathan Kuminga, which of course leads us to what's going to happen with the other veterans on the roster. Draymond, Andrew Wiggins, Steph, these guys are all under contract for next season. They're all under contract long term. And if they really wanted to go the cost-cutting route, they could try and dump the Wiggins contract in a similar fashion, a way they got rid of the Jordan Poole contract last offseason. Similar line of thinking for Draymond potentially as well if they really wanted to tear things down. But again, then what are you leaving for Steph? They're in a very weird situation here where they clearly aren't good enough to compete. They don't want to have an extremely expensive roster, but they also don't want to completely tear things down and trade away Steph. I don't think they're at that point. But the point that they are at is the Warriors' days of kind of being on the outskirts of contention, potentially still being able to make a run at a title. I think those days are over. It has to come from, if they're going to get back to that point while Steph is still really good, it's going to have to come from either a Kuminga trade or a ton of growth from Kuminga or do awesome in the draft. And even then, the possibilities are really, really slim. And this is the first time that I've truly entertained the idea that Steph within the next 18 months might not be a Golden State Warrior anymore, because at a certain point, even as good as he is, I don't really know how he can just stick around and they're going to win 40, 45 games. I know that's not his demeanor. I know that he, loves being there, wants to stick around, but this season more than any other has felt like things really starting to shift and change where, Clay, Draymond, Steph, one of those guys probably isn't going to be there next year, probably most likely Clay. Real thoughts about trying to slim down the roster from a payroll perspective and just trying to do things in a different way than they've done over the last couple of seasons where they've continued to reinvest. They've tried to do, we've got the young guys and the veterans and we're going to pay everybody. They've tried to continue to push, and they were rewarded with a title a few seasons ago, but that window, in my opinion, has closed. This current construction of the Golden State Warriors is no longer realistic to think that they could possibly win a title with this group. And at this point, it's just time to make some changes. At some point, that also represents an exciting opportunity because you get to see what some of these young guys are going to bring to the table. And like I said, I do think there's a decent future there, although it's probably not championship level. But it's just, when I say they're done, it just means kind of this version of the Warriors have had over the last couple of seasons. It's just not going to be the same after this year. Now, at the end of the day, maybe they bring back Clay. Maybe they make a move and trade Kuminga and they're really good next year. I mean, that is an outside possibility. But I think at the end of the day, the ownership group is just going to look at this and say, we've had a ton of success. I don't really know how it makes sense for the expense to not match the production to the extent that it has. I mean, I'd have to imagine that when the ownership group in Golden State decided to pay as much money as they did for last year's team and this year's team, they expected to actually make the playoffs this year. They expected to win some playoff games this year. And it's one thing to have a disappointing year, have some injuries, maybe finish as the 5th or the 6th seed, not win a series. And it's another to have one of the most expensive rosters in the entire league and not even make the postseason. And that kind of a difference between expense and production can lead to some real dramatic and drastic change. And whether it be this offseason or within the next 18 months, I think that's something that is definitely coming for these Golden State Warriors.